hi everybody. Thanks very much for coming out on this chilly day to hear about my research. Today what I want to do is tell you about one line of research I've been working on with one of my colleagues, Jason Flax, in the Department of Psychology. And what we've been investigating is how older people's, compared to younger people's, lay theories about ability might predict or influence their memory performance. So what I want to start with is to sort of show you kind of a typical scene in at least in a psychology lab when we bring in an older adult, say, to do a psychology test or battery of cognitive measures. So when you look at the scene, you can think about, well, what might be affecting this woman's memory performance when she's doing this task? So one of the things that we would all probably think about is there would be factors coming from biological aging that could be affecting her performance. So what might be some of those biological factors that could affect her performance? Can anyone think of anything? What's changing biologically as we age that could make your brain, right? Okay, so there's neurological changes with age that could be affecting her memory performance. Depending on the task, if it requires a speeded response, for example, you could see effects of physical aging in the form of, say, for example, arthritis in the hands or things like that, or other sensory motor issues going on that could affect the speed of response, the accuracy of response, and so forth. So those are just examples of some of the different ways that biological factors could influence her performance. Another thing that people have looked at are testing conditions. So, for example, what's going on in the immediate environment when she's doing these tasks? So is it quiet? Is there not a lot happening around her so she can focus on these tasks? Is she familiar with the equipment and whatever is needed for that particular task? And so is she therefore comfortable and more confident and ready to take on these tasks? And, you know, what are the types of tasks that she's being asked to do? How familiar is she with those types of tasks versus, say, more novel tasks? So those are all things that different areas of gerontology research, aging research, psychology research have looked at. But what I want to talk about more today are what are some social factors that could be influencing her performance. And when I talk about social factors here, I'm really talking about a variety of different possible social factors. So let's take a look at that. One would be age stereotypes. So what are some stereotypes about older adults? Maybe some of our older adults can tell us what some of the stereotypes are that they face.
Being slower,
being
not
slower,
hearing well.
Poor hearing, being slower. Anything else that's stereotyped about older people?
But they're not cognitively aware.
Not cognitively aware, right? Yeah, so there's a lot of negative stereotypes having to do with sort of competence-related ability types of issues. And research in my lab and other labs has shown that not only are older adults aware of these stereotypes, but in fact, we all are very aware of these stereotypes, and we're exposed to these stereotypes from a very early age. So even when we're children, we see depictions of older people as cognitively impaired, poor hearing, frail, and so forth. You actually get exposed to both positive and negative stereotypes about older people. Positive stereotypes include sort of aspects of warmth and nurturance and kindness. And the negative stereotypes have to do more with these competence types of issues. And what one of my colleagues in the field, Becca Levy, has shown and suggested is that because we get exposed to these from an early age, when they're not relevant and they don't apply to us, we don't really think to question them that much and sort of contradict them. And so you start to kind of internalize them as sort of that's just how older people are. And so by the time you become an older person yourself, you kind of have this image of how an older person is, and you haven't really built up sort of the resistance or the tools to say, hey, or to challenge that and say, maybe this isn't accurate and it doesn't apply to me. So what I'm talking about here is self-stereotyping, that there's been some research suggesting from my labs and others that older adults will fall prey to these age stereotypes, these negative age stereotypes, and apply them to the self. They'll engage in self-stereotyping, and that can negatively impact their performance. Another area of research other labs have investigated in terms of social factors are control beliefs. And some research has shown that the degree to which older people believe that they have control over their cognitive abilities and their memory performance in particular can really influence how well or how poorly they do on memory tests. So a sense of control has been shown to be an important social factor as well. Related to that is another kind of set of beliefs, and that are sort of all those beliefs fall under this umbrella called metamemory, or metacognitive beliefs more broadly. Here what people have been looking at is people's beliefs about their memory ability, whether they perceive that their memory ability has changed over time, what their expectations are about their memory ability in the future, what they think they're capable of in terms of memory, and so forth. So the way that's been measured, it's kind of a broader constellation of beliefs. It kind of sometimes brings in these control beliefs and sort of what I'll talk about in a second, self-efficacy beliefs and so forth, under sort of this whole constellation of beliefs about one's own abilities. And related to that is self-efficacy. And when people talk about self-efficacy, does anyone know what self-efficacy is? Could give us a sort of a working definition of that? Yeah.
An individual's beliefs about like his or her capabilities, if they can complete something.
Precisely. So self-efficacy refers to the ability, or what a person's beliefs are about their ability to take on and complete or do a task. So it's very important and has been shown to influence how well or how poorly people will do on a task. So these are all the different social factors that have been shown to influence older adults' memory performance. Excuse me. But I want to suggest that there's another sort of category or class of beliefs that might also be very powerful in predicting performance. And that is people's implicit theories of ability. And I'll show you a definition of implicit theories in a second, but what I want to argue here is that, well, I'm not really arguing it, I'm reissuing this argument with respect to applying it to the field of aging. But what has been shown with younger age groups is that implicit theories seem to be these very broad, basic theories that people have about ability in general, humans' abilities, and that can really underlie or serve as sort of the base layer of beliefs that then feeds forward and affects people's beliefs about others' abilities and lack of abilities, and beliefs about one's own abilities, so self-related beliefs as well as other-related beliefs. So let me just walk you through a little bit what I mean by people's implicit theories. So Carol Dweck is the pioneer in this area of research, and she was really interested in children and performance in education in particular. And she came up and developed this idea of implicit theories and found that, sort of in addition to people's specific beliefs that I just told you about a minute ago, like their control beliefs about themselves, their meta-memory feelings, their feelings of self-efficacy, their age stereotypes about other people and whether they fall prey to those stereotypes themselves, that at a very broader level, everybody seems to have these sort of lay or working theories about humans' abilities, about different things. And so what she did was coin this sort of set of beliefs. She termed it in people's implicit theories, because we kind of implicitly carry them around with us on a daily basis and apply them to ourselves and to others. So she's referring to people's beliefs about human traits and abilities. And what she argues is that these beliefs they fall along a continuum, but you can kind of think about people falling generally at one end of the continuum, mostly, or at the other end of the continuum. And at one end are people who would hold an entity theory about abilities. And this is the view that abilities are fixed, that we're born with certain degree of levels of ability in different domains, and that those abilities or levels stay fixed throughout time. They don't change. So for example, if you think about intelligence and beliefs about intelligence, if you look at one of the scales they use to look at people's lay beliefs, in this case in the domain of intelligence, an item that shows sort of an entity type of belief would be everyone has a certain amount of intelligence, and there's not much that can be done to really change that. So that would be, if you endorse that kind of view, you would agree with that kind of item, say yes, that's absolutely true, you're born smart or you're not born smart, and that's it, you know, and that's how it is. If, on the other hand, you had a contrary view to that, you could be an incremental theorist. And here the view is that abilities are malleable. So, in other words, you might be born with a certain level of ability in a particular domain, but if you're an entity theorist, you believe that that can be changed, that could go up, and we'll talk about this later, that it could also perhaps go down. But in the case of, with her work focusing on children and youth, the idea was really, you know, a trajectory of growth, that if you're an incremental theorist, you believe that you can modify and usually improve abilities if that's needed. And so an example of an item in the domain of intelligence from the scales they've used to assess this would be no matter who you are, you can always change your intelligence. So, for example, an entity theorist would think that an intelligence test, you know, you're born with a certain level of intelligence, and that, therefore you would score a certain score on an intelligence test. And there's not much you can do to improve your score on an intelligence test. But an incremental theorist would say, well, actually, we could do a lot of training with you so you become familiar with these kinds of tests, you know, practice other versions of it, give you lots of education so you learn lots of knowledge, and then when you go to take this intelligence test, you can do, you know, better than if, you know, we had, compared to, say, someone with the same intelligence level that started out that we hadn't done these types of things with. Now, that might sound familiar particularly to the undergraduates here in terms of this idea that you could maybe improve a test score. Can you think of any sort of tests that you might take where you might try to really practice and get ready for to try to optimize your performance for it? The things you have to kind of, but beyond sort of your classroom things you do all the time and for any particular course, there's sort of bigger tests you have to do along the way as you go, say, from undergraduate to postgraduate. Does anything ring a bell?
The MCATs and the LSATs.
LSATs,
and even
MCATs.
TOEFL tests.
Yep, GREs, TOEFLs, all of these types of things. You know, the premise for, like, say, the Kaplan preparation for those tests and things like that is basically an incremental theory. That if you go in and take this Kaplan course and learn how to, you know, prepare for the GRE, that you can improve whatever score you would have without that kind of preparation. So you can kind of see these theories sort of feeding into different kinds of programs that come out of them. Okay, yeah, sure.
How do you distinguish between intelligence and knowledge?
Well, that's
knowing about things versus being intelligent, being able to.
Right. That, I mean, I'm not going to get too much into intelligence testing because that's a huge contentious field.
I don't mean IQ testing,
right.
But
yeah, but that would be an argument that's been brought up about IQ testing, for example, that many of these types of tests actually tap into knowledge that you have to acquire through education, and so people that don't have those opportunities score more poorly simply because of the fact they don't get all the knowledge that they need to do it. So I think that's one of the issues within the IQ testing and intelligence literature that I'm not sure has really been resolved yet. So, but it's a good point. Okay, so now that we have a sense of what people's implicit theories are, let me just go back to what I was saying earlier about how there's this view that these implicit theories, because these are theories we're carrying around about humans' abilities, not just me, not just you, but humans' abilities in general, that implicit theories really represent kind of an overarching set of theories that we have, and that those then, within those kind of feed forward and drive our beliefs about the self as well as our beliefs about others. And so when we talk about the beliefs about the self, that's going back to those social factors I talked about earlier. That's really where some of these other more specific idiosyncratic beliefs are coming from. So our beliefs that, you know, about whether or not we have control over our memory, whether we perceive memory change over time, our meta-memory beliefs, whether we have a sense of self-efficacy as we go and prepare to take, say, a memory test. So it's been argued that these sort of implicit theories underlie these more self-related beliefs, because you go kind of from a broad humanity-related belief and then apply that to the self. And then on the other side of the coin as well, it's been suggested that these implicit theories also underlie our beliefs about others, and in the case of what we're interested here today, in particular stereotypes, or in this case stereotypes about older adults, and whether then you apply those stereotypes to the self. And some of the research has suggested with other groups. This hasn't really been shown that much with older adults yet, in particular with age, but that it's been shown with other groups and other stereotypes that people who hold entity theories tend to really endorse group stereotypes in general. And then they also seem to then apply those stereotypes to the self more than incremental theorists do. So why would an entity theorist maybe endorse a group stereotype perhaps more than an incremental theorist would? Do you have any ideas about that? No? Well, if we go back to our working definition of what an entity theorist is, remember that's somebody who believes things are very fixed. You have these traits, you have these abilities from birth, and so you can see that, you know, group stereotypes really talk about people from this group are this way. They have this trait, this ability, they do this behavior, whatever. And so you can see a real correspondence between having kind of that entity view and then applying these kinds of stereotypes to others. And as well, it's been shown with entity theorists and other group stereotypes that they sometimes will then also apply it to the self and engage more in self-stereotyping than incremental theorists would. So now what I want to do is, as I've suggested already, the bulk of the work on implicit theories really has been done with younger age groups, has really been thought about within the idea of improving an ability. If you believe an ability is malleable, then the idea is generally a trajectory of improvement as there's growth through childhood into young adulthood and so forth. But really, there hasn't been a lot of thought given to what about the implications for aging. So what I want to do first is just sort of set the stage for where my colleague Jason Plax and I came from in thinking about how to apply implicit theories to aging. And so our first premise was to suggest that in general we believe that, you know, and the literature has shown this, that most people don't really think that as we get older, that in later life you really have much of a trajectory of improvement for most domains. Now there's one that's an exception, we can talk about that in a minute. But there's studies that have looked at, they've had people, young, middle, and older adults, you know, sort of talk about at different ages, different decades, you know, are you still improving in this domain and getting better, or do you start seeing decline at this particular age, and, you know, does that decline continue? So they talk about research on sort of perceived gains and losses with age. And the bulk of the perceptions held by all of these age groups is that as we age, we tend to see and expect more gains than losses. So that's an important thing to think about, because when we're trying to think about applying implicit theories in the realm of aging, what are we talking about? An expectation of improvement, or are we talking about some sort of other kind of expectation? So what we, after giving it a lot of thought, we decided, well, when we're talking about aging and expectations about abilities, maybe what we really are talking about is people's theories about decline and rates of decline. And what we suggest is that entity theorists in this case, with respect to aging, are really folks who believe that the rate of decline with aging cannot be altered, that it's fixed, that we're, you know, born with a, so to speak, biological clock, not talking about the reproductive one, but, you know, that our cells in our brain will age, and that they, you know, their function deteriorates, and that affects your cognitive ability, and there's not really anything you can do about that, that the age proceeds in a fixed trajectory, and that there's this decline, and it's inevitable and proceeds at a steady pace, and it can't be changed. So that's what we suggest is maybe the sort of working entity theory going on with respect to aging. So that's sort of the green light, that decline is proceeding ahead and can't be changed. On the other side, maybe incremental theorists, in contrast, are those that really kind of have more of that use it or lose it mentality, that you should be doing things with your memory ability, that you can do things to slow down the rate of cognitive decline or memory decline, and that maybe in some instances, depending on what it is you're talking about, you could even halt the rate of memory decline. You know, it depends on what we're talking about and so forth. But you can see these could have very different perspectives about people's sort of working lay theories about aging and memory ability in this particular case. Are there any questions about that before I go on? Okay. So our working hypothesis for the work I'm going to show you today is that in terms of memory performance, our hypothesis is that older adults who have an incremental theory about aging and memory are going to outperform and do better than and have higher scores than older adults who have an entity theory. And we think that's because the entity theorists are really kind of walking around with this and agree with this idea that memory decline is inevitable with aging, you can't do anything about it, whereas incremental theorists have a more flexible view of aging and memory decline and think that there are things you can to do to maintain your memory ability and slow the rate of aging. So we'll come back to that hypothesis throughout the studies and see if that's what we find. So let me just give you an overview of the present research. We did 3 studies to look at this question of whether you would see differences in memory performance between entity theorists and incremental theorists. And in study 1, what we did was we developed a measure. We took some of these implicit theories measures that are out there for other domains, but none have been developed with respect to aging and memory. So we adapted one to assess older adults' lay theories about and beliefs about human memory in general. And we measured that and then also looked at their memory performance to see if their beliefs would predict their memory performance. So I'll show you that in a second. In a second study, we decided, in the first study we focused on beliefs about memory ability. But in the broader field of work on implicit theories, with younger age groups, they've shown that you can even find effects with people's views of abilities in general. So not only do they find effects of people's lay theories, say for intelligence or athletic ability or what have you in very domain-specific areas, they find influences if you assess people's beliefs about human abilities in general and you don't specify a domain. So we wanted to see if that was true in this case, that if we measured older adults' beliefs about human abilities in general, you don't even mention memory in this case, just, do you believe that you're born with fixed abilities and traits, or do you believe that your abilities and traits can be modified and are malleable over time? And we want to see if this even broader sense of these beliefs would also be predictive of older adults' memory abilities. And then in the third study, we wanted to start to understand how these beliefs might be affecting or influencing older adults' memory performance. And so one of the variables we examine in our third study is the role of affect or emotion. So how do older adults report feeling when they're doing these memory tests? And do those feelings differ for older adults who hold entity theories versus those who hold incremental theories? And also, in our third study, the first 2 studies I'm going to show you are what we call correlational studies. So in that instance, we're measuring people's beliefs and we're measuring their performance, and then we're seeing how their beliefs predict their performance. And that's called a correlational study. We're not manipulating anything or trying to experimentally control anything. So in the third study, we actually take an experimental approach to this, and we actually prime people or get them to think about an entity theory or an incremental theory and see if we get performance differences for those that we start to get them to think about entity theories of aging and memory versus incremental. And then we also measured their affect, their emotion, to see how that related to their performance. Any questions before I go on? Yeah.
What were the ages in your study?
I'll show you with each study so you can see exactly. Okay, so let's take a look at study 1. We had 83 older adults come into the lab. Mean age was 70. They ranged between 60 and 80 years. These folks come from our adult volunteer pool in the Department of Psychology. We post ads in the Toronto Star every year and in some seniors magazines in the GTA asking for community dwelling older adults who can transport themselves to our lab downtown, and they need to be age 60 plus. And they need to feel able to get to the psychology laboratories, transport themselves. And we assure them that they don't need to be experts on computers. That used to be more of an issue 10 years ago when we started this pool, but we're finding more and more we don't need to, we're having fewer and fewer older adults who have any concerns about computers. So it's nice that that sort of source of anxiety is diminishing as generations get used to computers and are very comfortable with that. So, but we still throw that in just to make sure we're trying to be as inclusive as possible. Okay. So just want to point out they're, relatively healthy sample. If on our scale of 1 to 5, 5 being excellent health, they're averaging around a 4. But that's not surprising because we're trying to get community dwelling folks who are independent and healthy enough to get themselves to campus. And they tend to be, we ask for, I think, grade 12 education or higher. We do have some folks that are lower than that, which is fine. But we're trying to sort of match our younger and older people approximately a little bit closer in education as much as we can, although we can statistically control for that as well. So some of our faculty who do work with older adults often are testing younger and middle-aged people, and so they're trying to sort of at least control for education level along the way. Okay, so here's what happened in the first study. When they came into the lab, they first completed the Implicit Theories measure. This one was specific to the domain of memory and aging. And they responded to a series of statements, and for each statement they had to indicate how much they agreed or disagreed with each statement. An example of an incremental statement in the measure was, no matter how old you are, you can change your memory ability considerably. An entity statement was, to be honest, people really can't change their ability to remember things. Then after they completed that measure embedded with a bunch of other filler measures, and then they went on to do a free recall task. And in this task, they were on the computer presented with 16 high-frequency words. High-frequency means it's very common in the English language. We use these words a lot every day. And so there are words like sky, toast, watch. They saw each word appear for a few seconds on the screen, and then it would go off, and then the next word would come on. So they had plenty of time to look at it. It would go off and so forth. After the 16 words had appeared, then a screen would come up saying recall, and that was their signal to write down on a piece of paper as many words as they could remember that they had just seen on the computer screen. So a very standard free recall test. Of course, we're interested in seeing how many did they correctly recall. They didn't have to recall them in any particular order, but just out of 16, how many did they remember? So we did a regression where we entered participants' age, and that was to try to sort of get a sense of any possible biological factors that are predicting their performance, as well as their implicit theory scores, And then we also included an age by implicit theory interaction term to see if maybe, our older adults who are more like 80 years old, maybe we're seeing a difference in how their implicit theories influence their memory performance compared to our older adults who are 60 years old, for example. So we wanted to try to account for those different things. This is what we found. We did find sort of your typical age effect. So as you get older, you tend to do more poorly on these tests. That's a very standard effect. But what's of more interest I want to show you here is setting that aside, in addition to that influence, we found an effect of older adults' implicit theories of memory and aging. And so how this is set up in this graph is, on the left-hand side of this line would be people who scored more in the entity range of our scale, and on the right-hand side of this graph is people who scored more in the incremental side of this scale. And so as you can see, the more that a person held incremental views of memory and aging, the better they tended to do on the memory test, the more items they successfully or accurately recalled. And this was not moderated by age. So in other words, older adults of all the different ages that we tested showed this difference about being either an entity or an incremental theorist. There was no interaction. Okay, so study 1, we showed that entity versus incremental theory endorsement did predict older adults' memory performance. And just to refresh your memory on what the aims of study 2 were, one is, the first study just was with older adults. We wanted to bring younger adults into the lab and see what would happen if we had them do this type of test. And we actually expected not to find much with young adults. And the reason for that is that in the case of memory and aging, younger adults are not carrying around a negative view about memory and aging with respect to the self. Now, they certainly could be, in general, having beliefs about memory and aging, because we talked about these, stereotypes that everyone's exposed to from very early childhood, but that those are not, at this point in their lives, are not relevant to the self. So they're not going to necessarily fall prey to the influence of these theories. So we expected that this wasn't really going to have an effect for them. But we wanted to make sure that that was the case. So we brought them into the lab to see if they would show a different response, and also would we get, with another sample of older adults, would we replicate our effect with a different group of older adults. And as I mentioned earlier in the lead into the studies, we wanted to test older adults, and in this case younger adults, broader theories of implicit theories in general. So beyond the domain of memory and aging, would we find the same influence of people's lay theories about human abilities in general, not domain specific? So here we're going to go beyond domain specificity of memory ability and look at general theories. And then also in this study, we included a couple other possible social predictors of cognitive performance in older adults, because we wanted to see how do implicit theories hold up if you test them against some of these other variables that have been shown to be predictive of older adults' cognitive performance. So here are samples again. The young adults were psychology undergrads in the Department of Psychology, average age about 20 years old. Our older adult sample is very similar to what I showed you before, about 70 years old. The young and older, obviously healthy, about the same age of education range. And then I just wanted to show one other interesting thing, which I think, let's see if I've got a slide on this. I'm not going to show this. If you look at ITM score, I guess I just put it here. I took over my pointer, but you can see that we did find an age difference in ITM scores. So young adults tend to be more incremental theorists on average than older adults do. So they tend to have a more malleable view about human abilities in general compared to older adults. And so I think that's going to be an interesting thing to explore in the future, is to look at sort of the developmental trajectory of people's implicit theories, and do they perhaps change as you go through the life course? Do you start out with sort of one view, and then that view maybe shifts as you go through lots of different life experiences and forms of, testing or being tested in different ways and domains in your life? Sorry, did you want to say something?
No, you just
okay.
marked a whole bunch of things going off in my head, not the least of which is that those paradigmatic shifts may be social and not resting within the individual.
Mm-hmm. There could be a lot of reasons for why we're seeing
Sure.
this difference.
Could be a
But
combination.
absolutely, yeah, it could be outside the self and within the self, for sure. Okay, so our procedure, you'll see, is very similar to what I showed you before. I wanted to point out one other difference is in the first study, we measured people's implicit theories earlier in the study, and then they did their memory test later in the study. This time, just to make sure that we weren't finding something due to some sort of order effect, we had them do their memory test first, and then later in the session, they did the implicit theories measure, again embedded with a lot of other measures as well. The memory test was again the free recall test I told you about earlier, same test. Then the implicit theories measure was very similar, but now it's a general measure, general implicit theories, not domain specific to memory. So for example, an incremental item is you can substantially change the kind of person you are. An entity item is everyone's abilities are basically fixed, and there isn't really much that can be done to change that. And then the two other social measures we included that have been predictive of older adults' memory performance in other studies are their attitudes towards older adults in general. So are they positive or negative towards older people? And then also people's fears of aging, which is kind of a more self-relevant. So one's kind of an other relevant attitude measure, and the other is self-relevant. So first, we found your typical age differences in free recall. This is very standard effect. Younger adults outperformed older adults on this kind of memory test. That's not true for every kind of memory, by the way, but for a free recall test, that's pretty typical. And then of more interest, of course, is what we found with respect to people's memory beliefs, their implicit theories, sorry, not their memory beliefs, their implicit theories about in general. And what you see here is an interaction with age and and their implicit theories. And in particular, the dark blue line is younger adults, and the light blue line is older adults. And you see that for older adults, we replicate the finding I showed you earlier in study 1, same almost kind of slope even, to some extent, and whereby older adults who are more incremental theorists outperformed older adults who are more entity theorists. But then with the dark blue line, the younger adults, it's just flat. So their performance really isn't affected or predicted by their implicit theories. And that's what we expected, is that implicit theories, with respect, they would not be applicable to the domain of memory, because younger adults are not walking around with sort of applying to the self these negative stereotypes and views about memory ability and aging in themselves. So we found a significant age group by implicit theories interaction, and all of the action is occurring with the older adults and nothing's really changing with the younger adults. Any questions about that? Okay, so study 2 replicated and extended study 1. We found again that the relation of implicit theories to memory extended to general beliefs about human abilities in general. And we also found that older adults' implicit theories predicted memory performance, but not younger adults' theories. And, I forgot to mention this, but these general implicit theories predicted performance even when we included these other social variables I mentioned earlier. So when we added into the regression analysis as other competing predictors, older adults' fears of aging and their younger and older adults' fears of aging and these attitudes towards older people, the implicit theories still were predictive of their abilities. So it's not the case that people's implicit theories about human abilities can be explained by or accounted for by some of these other types of various social variables that have been looked at in the past. So what we wanted to do in study 3 was, one of the issues with the first 2 studies I showed you is that they are just correlational. And so when you have a correlational study, you really can't talk about causality. We were sort of, the way I've been presenting it to you, I've been sort of presenting it in a causal way, saying that people's implicit beliefs predict their memory performance, but in reality, it could be that their memory performance is feeding into or feeding forward into their theories. And so what we really need to do is do an experiment to then try to actually be able to talk about causality. So a very common way in social psychology to do a type of experiment where we want to look at people's stereotypes or views about something is to prime them with that view. So far I've just showed you where we've measured people's chronically held views. In this case, what we're going to do is experimentally manipulate their implicit theories and get them to temporarily sort of take on either an entity theory or an incremental theory. And that's called priming. So, what we've sort of been talking about so far is that older adults and people of any age are sort of walking around and they're kind of walking entity theorists or they're incremental theorists. So you either think that a leopard can't change its spots, for example, or you believe that you can turn over a new leaf. And you kind of have this working theory that you carry around with you in everyday life. But for this particular experiment, we're going to actually try to get people to adopt a particular view, no matter what their underlying chronically held view is. And it's actually, you might be skeptical and think, well, how is that possible if you're carrying these sort of strongly held views? But in actuality, if you think about sort of like these expressions I just showed you a minute ago, we actually, both perspectives are kind of intuitive to us. We were exposed to this idea about whether or not a leopard can change its spots and whether or not you can turn over a new leaf all the time. There are sort of these expressions and situations where we think people can change or we think people can't change, no matter what our sort of baseline view is. So it suggests that things are, you can manipulate them at least on a temporary basis. So that's what we sought out to do in this study. So we brought older adults into the lab, and they were either randomly assigned to an entity condition where we get them to adopt temporarily, get them to think about or take on the entity perspective, or we randomly assigned them to the incremental condition and got them to think about things from an incremental point of view. And they're very similar in age and health and education. the procedure was very similar with a few exceptions, so I'll show you what's different here. So when they came into the laboratory, the first thing we did was to prime them with a particular implicit theory. And how we did this was we had them engage in a reading comprehension task where we had created a fake New York Times, online New York Times article. It's amazing these days that one of the great things about digital technology is you can also manipulate digital technology. So you can create all sorts of fake, we've done CBC News articles, New York Times, what have you. So we have, it looks pretty good. A New York Times article, and in it we've manipulated the text. We actually took a real New York Times article that had been published, so we had the material there, and then we just manipulated sort of what it was, the gist of what it was saying, the conclusions it was reaching. So it was actually based on something that older people would be exposed to all the time anyway. But we either framed it that, from an entity perspective, that decline is inevitable with respect to aging, or that decline is preventable, the incremental perspective. And we did that through talking about either neuronal degeneration, so that is the decline of the neurons in the brain, or neuronal regeneration. And this gets at this idea of plasticity, that we can generate new neurons if we challenge our minds, our brains, and that can facilitate neuronal growth, even in later life. And then after they read that, we did a manipulation check to make sure that they had taken on whichever perspective we wanted them to take. So let me just show you what the article looked like. I didn't have room to put everything, so I just took an excerpt from each to show you how they're similar and different. So whenever we try to create these kinds of materials in two different conditions that we want to manipulate, we try to keep them as equivalent as possible. So you really try to keep the wording as similar as possible, the length as similar as possible as you can, and then just subtly change a few things here and there. So you'll see in the highlighted portions in red, on the entity side, researchers are less optimistic than ever about the potential of the aging brain, whereas on the right-hand side, the incremental condition, researchers are more optimistic than ever about the potential of the aging brain. So it's very, minute or small word changes. And in the end of that paragraph, on the left-hand side, the entity condition, the brain has great difficulty growing new nerve cells. We try to keep it sort of, not get too technical. The brain can grow new nerve cells. And then the last sentence of the next paragraph, on the entity side, the birth of new nerve cells, she said, has been shown, this expert that's quoted, has been shown to occur only in adult rats and monkeys, but not in older adult humans, versus the incremental side. The birth of new nerve cells, she said, has been shown to occur not only in adult rats and monkeys, but also in older adult humans. Okay, so they read that paragraph. We did a manipulation check to see if they sort of now, to what extent do they believe that decline in the aging brain is preventable. I'll show you that in a second. And then they went on to take a free recall test, as I had shown you before, same one. And then we had them do an additional memory test because we wanted to start to sort of test how generalizable are these effects of implicit theories to other kinds of memory performance. So we gave them a working memory test. In this test, what they had to do was read a set of sentences and then recall the final word from each sentence in the order that was presented. So for example, you might read 3 sentences in a row, like, I'm going to be testing my own working memory if I try to do it. Maybe that's not a good thing to do. Let's say, you said Joe went to the grocery store. So store would be the last word of that sentence. And then Sue went to the gym. Gym would be the last sentence. And so after you read those 2 things, you actually would have to answer a question about each sentence. And then you would be asked, a recall screen would come up, and you'd have to then say store gym, because those were the last 2 that you were exposed to, the last 2 words. And what that gets at is working memory. Working memory is sort of your online memory you carry around with you that's kind of constantly sort of filtering information, generating information, recalling information, storing temporarily information. It has a capacity to it, a very fixed capacity. You can only hold so much in working memory. It's called your span or your capacity. So we wanted to see if older adults' working memory capacity would be, their performance and test of that would vary depending on which theory we got them to think about. And then after that, we had them, after they did those memory tests, we had them make some retrospective emotion ratings of how they felt prior to taking those memory tests, to doing those memory tests. So and in particular, we focused on some emotion words where we had them rate how anxious or worried they were prior to taking those memory tests. Because we wanted to see if feelings of emotions, particularly worry and anxiety, might differ for entity versus incremental theorists, and that might be predictive of their performance. So first, what you see here is the manipulation check data. This was a question we had amongst other questions about the article. We had sort of different reading comprehension and sort of editorial things like how easy was this to read and how enjoyable was it and so forth. We also asked, to what extent do you believe the brain can or cannot grow new nerve cells? And you can see those who were exposed to the incremental article reported believing that it's much more possible to, they believe more in plasticity, that the brain can generate new nerve cells in later life compared to folks in the entity condition. We found and replicated our effect from before with the free recall test. So those who'd been primed with the incremental view outperformed those who were primed with the entity view. And we also found that for the reading span task, those in the incremental condition had higher working memory spans, did better in the working memory task, reading span task, than those in the entity condition. And in terms of their emotions that they reported, particularly we were interested in feelings of anxiety and worry. We found that the those in the incremental condition reported feeling less worried heading into those memory tests than those who'd been primed with the entity view. And then finally, we wanted to see how these feelings of worry might have been related to or predictive of their memory performance. So we did what's called a mediation analysis, where this just shows you the direct relationship that, depending on which condition they were in, entity or incremental, that predicted their memory performance. That's just the graph I showed you earlier, that incremental did better than entity. And then we added to this analysis worry, and this shows you that incremental, so that it's a negative beta, meaning as you go from the entity to the incremental condition, the less worry people reported experiencing. And then worry was negatively related to recall performance, which is not that surprising. The more worried you are, the lower your recall was in the test. And when we put all of these components into the mediation analysis, we find that that's what that Z stat is at the bottom, that worry is a significant mediator of the effect of our entity versus incremental condition on recall performance. So why or how does the entity versus incremental manipulation affect older adults' performance? It seems to do it through affecting their, at least partially, one reason why is through affecting their emotional state and either heightening their anxiety and worry or perhaps decreasing it in the incremental case. We found the same pattern for the reading span task too. So we find this same role of worry playing a part in this process for both the free recall performance and the reading span performance. So just to, oh sure.
I have a question.
No problem.
When you were doing these tests, or you had the subjects come in,
Mm-hmm.
did you ever ask them what strategies they may have used to improve their memory? Because that does make a difference.
No, we didn't, but you will see that's one of my future directions that
Good.
I do want to take a look at. You've stated a bullet point that's in our near future. Okay. So just to sum up about this particular study, we found that entity versus incremental effects, on older adults' memory when we actually got them to think about one view versus the other, one theory versus the other. And we've now found this in the first two studies looking at people's pre-existing implicit theories, both, and then also when we temporarily manipulated their implicit theories. And this one thing that's to take away from this third study is because we found this effect for people who are primed with either entity or incremental, the fact that we get an incremental effect, there had to have been some older adults in that condition, the incremental condition, who normally have probably an entity theory about aging and memory. but they did pretty well if they were in that particular condition. And so it suggests that chronic entity theorists do not have inferior memory in general, that their memory ability actually might be just as good as an incrementalist. It's just that they're letting these views and these beliefs come in and maybe heighten their worry and then worsen their performance. So it actually is a hopeful message that you could maybe do something to address those older adults who hold entity views. Maybe you could do something to address that and improve their overall performance if we try to get at this social variable.
So taking an incremental strategy for the entity theorists.
Right, like getting them to think about an incremental view of aging and memory might be a way to pull them away from all the negative ramifications of an entity view.
You could then link the development of the incremental view to developing strategies to improve their memory. Absolutely.
Because I think if you start to get people to think about an incremental view, a natural thing is say, well, you can, reduce decline, you can do these things. And so the next question is how?
Exactly.
Right? So then you bring in those mechanisms, those techniques for doing that. Absolutely. And the other thing that comes out of this third study in particular is the role of affect, that the effect of the entity theory on memory seems to be at least partially driven by worry. That seems to be what's harming or worsening older adults' performance, is the anxiety that comes out of having this entity view. And in contrast, the incremental theorists reported little pre-task worry. So just to sum up, the present research shows that the effect of belief on older adults' memory extends beyond beliefs about the self to beliefs about humans in general. We saw that across the studies. That these general beliefs about humans do not have to be explicitly about memory. The first point I said it wrong. Present research shows the effect of beliefs on older adults' memory extends beyond beliefs about the self, so I think this about my memory, to beliefs about all humans in general. And then the next point is more about, now that we're talking about beliefs about humans, we showed that not only do you find these for beliefs about humans' abilities in different specific domains, but beliefs about humans' abilities in general. Okay, so it can be about abilities in general. And again, that these broad assumptions may lay the foundation for low controllability beliefs, that if you believe that humans' abilities are malleable versus fixed, that can then feed forward into how much control you feel you have over your own memory, for example. Also, another point is that implicit theories affect older adults' memory independent of biological aging processes. We had that age variable in there, chronological age, throughout all of our studies. And it did not moderate the influence of people's implicit theories. So it suggests that implicit theories are another piece of the puzzle on top of biological components that can influence older people's memory performance. All of our effects were obtained independently of age. And it suggests that these aging effects at the neurobiological level may be meaningfully exacerbated or perhaps attenuated by effects at the psychological level. And it suggests also that challenging implicit theories about human abilities may be a more efficient way to combat stereotypes. So maybe rather than worrying about trying to get at specific stereotypes about different groups and getting at all the different traits and abilities and behaviors you have to worry about with that, the content of the stereotypes, maybe we just need to take that broader perspective and go one level up and challenge it at that level, and that'll feed forward into stereotypes. So future directions. One is that we do want to directly compare the predictive strength of implicit theories for domain-specific versus general. We haven't, we had one study where we looked at domain-specific beliefs and another for general. We'd like to put both kinds of beliefs and theories into one study and see if they equally predict or what happens there. We want to see if entity and incremental theorists differ in memory strategies. There is one study out there that sort of has looked at this, but they didn't really measure entity and incremental theories in the way that most of the literature has examined. They looked at sort of skills and things like that, beliefs about skills. So we want to take the more traditional way that we've been using and implementing that's consistent with previous literature and really try to pin down what kinds of memory strategies entity versus incremental theorists report using, and can we get, for example, entity theorists to use some of these strategies if we may perhaps tackle their entity views, challenge them. We also want to look and see if entity and incremental theorists differ in self-stereotyping about aging and memory, so how much are they applying these stereotypes to the self. And we'd like to get a finer grained sense of the role of emotion. And, you know, we used a retrospective measure of emotion, so that is they'd already completed the memory test, and then we asked them to retrospectively think back to how they felt before they did that. We'd like to measure their emotion throughout the experiment, doing different kinds of measures, for example, physiological measures. We have a new colleague coming to our department who does a lot of work on heart rate and cardiovascular reactivity to different stressful situations, and has a lot of expertise in that. So we'd love to maybe hook up some older adults to her monitors and then see, you know, you account for their baseline level of stress and everything. Once you've got that figured out, then you can look and see above and beyond baseline. Are you seeing effects as people go through an experiment or doing different tasks and being asked to think about different things? And you can use that as an indication of stress and worry and anxiety. And then also we want to start taking a look at interventions and maybe priming older people with incremental theories and seeing if you can reduce their negative age stereotypes, boost their performance, and, you know, some of these other social variables we've talked about. So I just want to give a shout out to some of the folks that have helped us with this work. First of all, my colleague Jason Plax, who I did this project with. He's also in the Department of Psychology. And then some of the undergraduates who've helped us along the way, as well as the folks in my lab, the Adult Development Lab, and Shirk, who generously gave us money for this project as well. So thank you very much.
Can I just ask you a question? How long, the third study,
Mm-hmm.
what was the engagement of the older adults? For how long? What was the duration of the visit? Was it one single visit? Or
Yeah, most of these studies are an hour or less on average. And our older adults are better subjects than our younger adults in terms of engagement. You know, the younger adults are typically ones from the Psych 100 pool. They're there for course credit. And some of them want their credit as soon as they can get it. So we often, if we have, we track, we monitor what participants are doing through the study. Like our research assistants are kind of sticking their head in and out of the room and kind of making sure that they're paying attention, and we record how long they take to do the study. We now have a cell phone policy where everyone, young or old, has to hand us their cell phone. They can't have that with them anymore because that's become a huge problem. So we try to reduce distractibility and increase focus as much as possible. But actually, in terms of pure motivation, our older adults just tend to be more invested and engaged. So I don't think it's an issue for them. That's not a confound I'm particularly concerned about with them in terms of, you know, these are folks that are interested and engaged. They have many more questions at the end of the study. You know, once we've debriefed them, they want to know more.
That doesn't surprise me, but I wonder a little bit about that. And the reason I was asking you the question is I wonder if some of the issues of affect that you're picking up would be mitigated with increased exposure in the setting.
You know, that's always a concern with doing these studies in a university setting, right? Because if you think about this from a perspective of an older adult, let's say they get out of St. George Station, they're walking down the street, and they're surrounded by 20-somethings, largely speaking. I mean, there's we 40-somethings in there too. But, you know, for the most part, they're walking around in a sea of young adults. And then they get to Sidney Smith Hall, where we are. That's the heart of Faculty of Arts and Science, classrooms. There's just a lot going on in that building, right? And the building itself is not well laid out, so we try to do all these things to make sure that they don't get lost and they're comfortable. But, you know, it's a signal right away that this is not a place I normally go. This is a place that young people go to. So that's definitely an issue. We've always wanted to try to address that by maybe getting some huge grant where we could rent office space off campus that everyone has to go to. So it's sort of an equal playing field in terms of the age of people that are around the area. We don't have that kind of, we haven't been able to do that kind of grant. But having said that, one of my colleagues in the States did move his lab to a typical office building that has, say, doctor's offices in it that young and old would go to, dentist's office, things like that. And he still finds the stereotype threat effects that have been found in the literature. So in other words, the performance differences between young and old on these types of tests. So even if you immerse them in a more neutral environment, you still find a lot of these effects. So I feel confident that this is not all because of a comfort level with the setting, for example.
Right, but I think it would have an effect. I think looking at the first two studies where the mean educational age was about 12 years, as opposed to the third one where the mean age was about 15, that tells me that there's going to be a disparity in comfort levels among that group.
Yeah, I mean, the young adults that we're getting are about, say, 13 years of education, because they tend to be in their first year. And so on average, for most of our studies, they have about the same educational level as our older adults. Our older adults actually tend to be sometimes better educated than our young adults, because many of them have completed university.
That's right.
So they're kind of hovering around a 15 to 16 year range, and our young adults are in a 12 to 13 range on average. So you might find an educational significant difference that way, but it doesn't usually count for performance in either group, in either direction.
That's interesting.
Other questions?
I wonder if the discussion of brain plasticity that has become increasingly common now, programs, articles, books, whatever, do you think that'll affect these two competing views?
Quite possibly. And I showed you that data earlier, for example, with the age difference between younger and older people, that the older people's average implicit beliefs were lower, more towards the entity end than the young. But as we're seeing, I said, we've seen this shift in technology in our older sample and comfort with that, maybe we'll start to see those scores creep up more towards the incremental range. I mean, it's an empirical question about that. I think an interesting one. One of the things when I gave this talk recently at Baycrest Hospital and at the Rotman Research Institute there, and one of the researchers there suggested, which I think is a great idea that we definitely want to try, is look at motivation to engage in some of these plasticity type tasks. So, for example, there's the website Lumosity. You might have seen it on TV, where you can train your brain online. So maybe. So the suggestion was, see how interested they'd be in a 1-month subscription to Lumosity, or something like that, and would you find a difference for entity versus incremental theorists, or if we primed the entity theorists with incremental views, could we increase their motivation to maybe take on some of these strategies and things you can do to try to improve your memory.
Didn't Rotman come up? They were planning to develop their own program in competition with Lumosity.
Yeah, I don't think they have.
I was at Mars once where they talked about it.
Oh, okay.
But I haven't seen it.
I don't know if they've put anything up there or not. I mean, they had a grant where they were doing this very intensive memory training program with older adults, but they were coming into the lab and being, doing all these kinds of things. I have no idea if that's done or what the results are, and I don't know if they've developed a digital kind of online analog of that or not. So,
Thank you.
Anything else? Okay, well, thank you very much for coming and braving the chilly weather. I appreciate it. Thank you.